All right, let's talk about Delaware. You probably know it as the first state, right? But its story, well, it's anything but simple. It's this tiny state with this massive, complicated history. We're going to see how it became this total battleground of contradictions. A constant tug of war between North and South, freedom and slavery, and even progress and resistance. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll jump into the colonial tug of war for control. Then, we'll look at how Delaware started to forge its own identity. From there, we'll hit its big role in the Revolution, its super divided path through the Civil War, and wrap up with its long, and I mean long, journey towards civil rights. Okay, so let's set the scene. We're heading back to the early 1600s. This land along the Delaware River, it wasn't really a settled colony just yet. It was more like a prize up for grabs, and you had all these European powers, the Dutch, the Swedes, the English, all of them wanting a piece of the action. And what's really wild about this time is just how unstable everything was. I mean, look at this timeline. Power was changing hands like crazy. First, the Dutch show up in 1631. A few years later, boom, the Swedes set up New Sweden. But the Dutch, under the famously stubborn Peter Stuyvesant, they weren't having it. They come back and retake the whole area in 1655. And then, not even a decade later, the English just sweep in and kick everyone out. Can you imagine living through all that? This constant back and forth is what created this really unique kind of mixed culture that would pretty much define Delaware right from the get-go. But of course, we have to remember, long before any of these European flags were being planted, this land was already home. It was the ancestral home of the Lenni Lenape, the Susquehanna, and the Nanticoke tribes. For about half a century, they had to navigate this incredibly complex relationship of trade, but also a lot of tension, with wave after wave of colonists showing up on their shores. All right, so now the English are in charge. But that doesn't mean the fight for control was over. Not at all. Delaware's next big chapter is all about this internal struggle for its own political identity. It was basically trying to step out from behind the huge shadows of its neighbors, Pennsylvania and Maryland. So when the English took over, the king gave the land to William Penn. Simple, right? Wrong. There was a huge problem. Lord Baltimore, the guy who ran Maryland, was like, hey, wait a minute, I have a claim to that land too. And this kicked off a legal battle between these two guys that dragged on for 100 years. The whole thing was fought in London courts, all about who really owned these so-called lower counties on the Delaware. And this 100-year headache was finally put to rest by a couple of surveyors you've probably heard of, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon. Yeah, that Mason and Dixon. Their work did two huge things. First, it created the Mason-Dixon line, which, later became this super symbolic dividing line between the North and the South. And second, it confirmed this really unique feature, the 12-mile circle arc around the town of Newcastle. These two surveys are the reason Delaware has the very distinct and, frankly, kind of weird borders it has today. And this quote right here, this is the moment. This is when Delaware's political independence really starts. In 1704, they basically agreed with Pennsylvania to make their own laws separately. Now, they still shared a governor, but getting their own legislative assembly, that was a huge deal. For the very first time, Delaware was starting to call its own shots. And you know what? That independent streak turned out to be absolutely crucial as things started getting heated with Great Britain. Despite being so small, Delaware was about to step onto the national stage in a big way and play a surprisingly decisive role in creating the United States. This right here, this is the moment that cemented Delaware's place in American history forever. December 7th, 1787. Its delegates get together and they vote unanimously to ratify the brand new U.S. Constitution. And here's the kicker. They were the very first state to do it. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was this bold, fast move that really helped build momentum for the new government. And that's how Delaware earned its proudest nickname, the First State. But Delaware didn't just contribute on paper, they were in the fight too. The Battle of Cooch's Bridge, it was the only major revolutionary battle fought on Delaware soil. You had about 700 colonial troops who set up an ambush for the advancing British. Now, they were seriously outmanned and eventually had to retreat, but it was this really brave move that slowed the British down and showed everyone that Delaware was all in. Okay, so the new nation starts to find its feet in the 1800s, and Delaware begins to modernize. But there's a catch. As its economy starts to boom, this deep, dark division within its society just gets wider and wider, and it's all centered on the institution of slavery.
And a huge driver of this change was one family, the DuPonts. They were actually fleeing the French Revolution, and they set up a gunpowder factory on the Brandywine River. This thing grew into an absolute industrial giant. It supplied the U.S. military and basically turned the whole Wilmington area into an economic powerhouse that was super connected to Philadelphia. And this chart tells the whole story of that growing divide. Just look at the numbers for a second. Back in 1790, the population was pretty evenly spread out across the 3 counties, right? But then, fast forward 50 years to 1840, whoa. Newcastle County up north, that's the industrial hub, its population has just exploded. Meanwhile, the more rural agricultural counties down south, Kent and Sussex, they grew way, way slower. This isn't just about numbers. You're literally seeing the state split into 2 different worlds, economically and culturally. And this all leads to one of the single biggest contradictions in Delaware's entire history. So get this. On the eve of the Civil War, Delaware was, legally speaking, a slave state. But, and this is a huge but, by 1860, as you can see here, over 90% of its black population was free. How? Well, it was a mix of owners freeing their slaves, a practice called manumission, and just the influence of being next door to abolitionist states like Pennsylvania. So you can imagine, this put Delaware in this incredibly weird and fragile position as the country was tearing itself apart.
Which brings us to the ultimate test of Delaware's identity. The nation splits apart, and Delaware, with its northern factories and its southern traditions, is caught right smack in the middle. Its role in the Civil War, it's maybe the biggest contradiction of them all. So it all boils down to this one big question, right? A Union state with slavery. How does that even work? How can you stay loyal to the Union, send your soldiers to fight for it, but at the same time legally protect slavery inside your own state? It just doesn't seem to add up. Well, when it came time to choose, Delaware chose the Union. On January 3rd, 1861, the legislature voted, and they voted decisively against seceding. So why? When it comes right down to it, it was about the economic. Its entire lifeblood, the factories, those DuPont gunpowder mills, all the trade coming through Wilmington, it was all tied to the industrial North. In the end, those economic ties were just stronger than any of the cultural sympathies people had with the South. But calling Delaware a Union state and leaving it at that, it's just way too simple. Because it was also home to Fort Delaware, which became one of the Union's biggest and, frankly, most notorious prisons for Confederate soldiers. The conditions there were just horrific, especially after the Battle of Gettysburg, when thousands and thousands of prisoners were sent there. We're talking about 2,500 men dying from smallpox, scurvy, you name it. A really stark and brutal reality to have inside a state that was fighting for the Union. So the Union wins the war. But that victory didn't magically fix Delaware's internal conflicts, not even close. In fact, for the next 100 years, those same divisions would define this really long, really painful, and, you guessed it, contradictory journey toward racial equality. Just take a look at this timeline of what happened right after the war. It's pretty shocking. In 1865, right after a war fought over slavery, Delaware's legislature votes to reject the 13th Amendment, the one that abolished slavery. Then they reject the 14th and 15th Amendments for citizenship and voting rights. It took them until 1901, 36 years late, to even symbolically ratify the abolition of slavery. I mean, this isn't just dragging your feet. This was active official resistance to the very things the war was fought over. And yet, here we go with another one of those fascinating Delaware twists. The very same state that was so fiercely resisting all of this, it also becomes the source of a major challenge to segregation. A lawsuit that started right there in Delaware, Gebhardt v. Belton, was one of the 5 cases that the Supreme Court rolled into its massive landmark 1954 decision, Brown v. Board of Education. You know, the one that made school segregation unconstitutional for the whole country? Yeah, part of that started here. But here's the thing. A Supreme Court ruling from Washington doesn't just instantly change things on the ground. The decision was met with fierce, organized resistance back in Delaware, especially in the southern counties. It took another 13 years of protests, of political fights, of boycotts, before the state schools were finally actually desegregated in 1967. So, from a colonial prize to the first state, from a Union state that protected slavery to a state that helped end segregation. Delaware's history is just a masterclass in contradiction, isn't it? We hope this explainer helped connect some of those dots for you. And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive, we've got a whole playlist of U.S. state histories you should check out. And of course, be sure to subscribe to Notebook Summaries for more. Thanks for joining us.